Morning. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to do a real quick introduction of our team here. My name is Bill Stott. I'm an architect and a principal with AO, the architectural offices. We've been practicing in Omaha since '81 and have been involved in virtually all types of housing and commercial construction that's been out there. I have had a passion for missing middle before. Probably I was an early adopter, recognizing the need. Our office is in Dundee, and there's some really amazing examples of that era and type of housing, and I've always been attracted to it. I gravitated towards the kind of quasi-formal missing middle organization when it formed up here. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Grace, and she'll talk about herself a little bit.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. My name is Grace Thomas. I'm a senior associate with Veritas Group, which is a small environmental sustainability consulting company here in Omaha. I got involved in missing middle about 2.5 years ago, and I have a passion for it as it relates to the environment, but I also just love neighborhoods that are walkable, bikeable, really vibrant, and have lots of different housing options for everyone. I'm the kind of unofficial person that is organizing and running the campaign right now, and we'll talk a little bit about what we do later, but I'll put my contact information in the chat at the end of the presentation as well. And I'll pass to Derek to have him introduce himself.
Good morning, Derek Miller, Long Range Planning Manager for the City of Omaha Planning Department. Good to see everyone again.
All right, Grace, if you could go ahead and throw that up. Before we get started, I wanted to throw out a couple things. First, we are going to be talking about a lot of things that are really complex, and we're going to be talking about them in really simplistic forms. So obviously, almost everything we say, you could say, yeah, but there's also this. This is a real high-level discussion, and we would be happy to entertain any follow-up questions. This is going to be pretty informal. So however you feel comfortable jumping in, throw something up into the chat, unmute yourself and ask a question. Or I don't know that I'm very good at raising hands because I can only see 5 of you at a time, but if that's great, somebody will see you. So as we move forward, let's make this interactive. Second, one thing from my own perspective, Missing Middle is a really complicated organization. It's really easy to get behind because it addresses so many different needs in the city, everything from public transportation to affordable housing to density, which has tax implications and economic implications. The problem with it, though, is because it addresses so many different things, it's a very difficult soundbite to take in. So a lot of people don't understand it, and a lot of people agree with parts of it, but not necessarily the others if they're more interested in public housing or they're more interested in public transportation, and all of that is okay. All of that's good. It solves a lot of different issues. So, okay, so this is your team. This is the first time we've ever done this presentation. So it's simultaneously going to be the best job we ever did of it, and also the worst. So I'll let you guys decide which one of those it is. So go ahead, Grace. So this is a kind of a little tongue-in-cheek intro. I'm going to go through housing a little bit, kind of talked about where we got from there to here. It's not going to take 90 seconds. But if we studied it for a year, if we studied it for 10 years, some people spend their entire career studying it and don't completely comprehend it. So it's going to be a big dive. The one takeaway I want you to understand is that since there has been housing, there's been haves and have-nots. There's been the people, and use whatever term you're interested in when you address that. There's the people with the money and the people without the money, the people that own the work and the people that do the work, whichever. But even back into the feudal times, the workers ended up in kind of crappy little houses down by where the work was, by the fields. And the kings were at the top of the hill in their big fortress, which is where all the money was and the wealth was. And not much has changed. So go ahead, Grace. One thing that really threw a wrench in this whole process, though, was the Industrial Revolution. And this will make sense when we get a little further down the road. But all of a sudden, people stopped living in huts by their fields because people started to move to the cities. And the Industrial Revolution required a lot of people in a very small area. The production of everything from textiles to machinery required tons and tons of labor. And where do you put all those people? You can't spread them out in a field anymore. Go ahead, Grace. So you saw these really crappy, dense living arrangements, places where people were forced to go vertically because they still needed to be close to work. They couldn't be all the way across town in the 1800s or the late 1700s because they had to get to work in the morning. So what ended up happening is factories kept popping up, housing kept getting more and more dense. The conditions got worse and worse. Everything from playgrounds to laundry to sales to markets to driving, everything happened on the streets because there was no parking, there was no grass, there was no yards. Go ahead. That started to change in the late 1900s. Again, I'm going to be really overly simplistic in this, but this is a streetcar map from Omaha in 1927. The streetcars actually started long before that, and most of them were actually created as private enterprises, mostly, a lot of them because they were built by land speculators who realized that if they wanted to sell house lots, they needed to be able to get people to live on them. And what this did is it really started to spread out the city. All of a sudden, you didn't have to have a carriage. And keep in mind, this is 1927, this picture, but in the beginning, really the only way you had to get around was a horse or on your feet. So all of a sudden, when you could be in a carriage that's pulled on a rail around town, you could get all the way across town, easily get to work, get back home. This is a very early Omaha streetcar, the horse-drawn streetcar. But it really enabled people to spread horizontally and still consider themselves being part of the city. The cities were still where all the work was, but you started to see the emergence of the suburbs. Go ahead. Was that a question?
I don't think so.
Okay, so then what you started to see is you started to see a less dense type of housing emerge. You started to see row houses and apartment buildings. Apartment buildings were really a big deal, and all of a sudden, people could live outside the city but still get to this city. You see, go ahead for a kind of slowly walk through these next couple of slides, Grace. There's nothing specific in any of these, but you see different types of housing that most of these houses are from Omaha, or these residences are from Omaha, and they're congregated around streetcar stops. Typically, the houses were a little bit further off of the stops, real closely in on the stops. The houses were very dense still in comparison to single-family detached houses, but still really wonderful examples of quality building, quality living, but people could simply walk a block or a half a block to the streetcar line, get on, go downtown and work. This was especially important for the emerging middle class as they started out, and single people, secretaries, office workers, clerks, people that weren't necessarily married with careers and homes. Okay. And then along came the automobile, and all of a sudden, you didn't have to be associated, you didn't have to live anywhere. You could live anywhere. And everything from the way we built cities to the way that we planned for cities started to change because of the automobile. Go ahead. Now that combined with a couple of things, the FHA loans and the GI Bill really kind of cemented the situation that we're in right now. The FHA loans were a really big deal back when they were created. I think it was in the 30s, I believe. But what it did is the government guaranteed loans so that all of a sudden you didn't have to have 20 or 30. There was no regulation at that point. Banks could charge you whatever down payment you wanted. So really the only way that you could ever afford a house is if you had enough wealth that you could build a house outright. This enabled people in the emerging middle class to start to purchase houses on their own. And of course, it's the American dream. It's what everybody wants to do. They want to live in a house. They don't necessarily want to live below another family or adjacent to another family. So you see single family housing start to really explode. Then combine that with the GI Bill in the middle of the century, and you see people coming back from, yeah, Corey, I'm going to come back to that a little bit. You start to see these houses spring up all over the place, especially with the GIs coming back from the war. They were given favorable loan rates and access to housing. Go ahead. And then you started to see developments like this. You started to see a very automobile-centric development. So when you look at this, you see pretty much all the houses look kind of the same. But one thing that you don't see is you don't see parks, and you don't see corner grocery stores, and you don't see the butcher shop. And so the expectation by the middle of the century was that everyone was going to have a car, and everyone was going to be able to drive to everything that they needed, everything from work to the grocery store, everything. Go ahead. And then, of course, that meant the streetcar was less important to the overall to the larger population. The streetcar was unimportant, or less important. So I think the last streetcar, if I'm not mistaken, was somewhere around I think 56, somewhere in there. It was in the mid 50s when the streetcar system was finally shut down in Omaha. Go ahead. But that left, now we kind of circle back to the whole have and have nots situation. That's a great deal for the haves, the people that have lots of money and have the ability to build a house out in Dundee or in Benson or down in Bellevue. They could still jump in their car and drive down in. But for the people that didn't have that money, they were kind of left in a situation where there was no housing. Many of the businesses, especially in Omaha, started to move out of the city core. You no longer have access to public transportation in the way that you did. And one of the solutions from the government was to just pack a bunch of people together, poor people, kind of back as we started to see back when the Industrial Revolution started. Put people into monolithic blocks of housing that were very dense and not necessarily healthy in any way. Go ahead. And then, of course, and this is where we kind of get back to, I think it was Corey that said that a little bit earlier, and that whole overview skips over the undercurrent of what was happening in most of the northern cities in the United States, which is redlining. You've probably, most of you are probably familiar with this image, this map. The letters represent areas where it was easiest to most difficult to get a loan for a home. The A's, which you can't really see, it's on the lower left. Virtually anyone could get a loan for a home there. B was a little bit more difficult. C was a little bit more difficult. And D, which is the traditional North Omaha section of Omaha, historic, it was almost impossible to get a loan there. Home ownership was not something that was easily obtained. So what this did is it created a situation where a lot of people were kind of stranded in their neighborhoods. Questions so far? So basically, I think that was the last slide. Is that right, Grace? Before we jump into the next section? Yeah. So basically, we are still in a situation where housing is based on how much money you have, whether you have or have not. The big houses out west, the smaller or densely packed houses in the urban core and in the traditional ethnic areas, both north and south in Omaha. The code, as and Derek's going to get to this, and I'll talk a little bit about it as well. The zoning code started to respond to the automobile pretty early and reinforced this concept of automobile-driven development, which created which exacerbated this situation of stranding some people in parts of the city where they didn't have access to other areas because the assumption was incorrectly, obviously, that everyone had a car and everyone could go wherever they wanted to go. It did not allow for a certain type. It no longer encourage certain types of housing because they weren't needed, which is the missing middle housing. So Grace, I'm going to hand off to you here.
Great. Thanks, Bill. So we just wanted to give a short overview of Missing Middle Omaha, what we mean when we talk about missing middle. So we're a grassroots campaign focused on removing barriers throughout Omaha to creating more missing middle, really advocating for these changes to come from strategic amendments to the zoning code. We have a few specific areas of the zoning code that we're focusing on right now, but we really also serve as kind of Omaha's educational foundation for why it's important to have different types of housing, who it benefits, and really trying to educate the public about missing middle. We do a lot of presentations at neighborhood associations. You can see some of these photo petitions taken at different festivals and events throughout Omaha. We also have a coalition of partners throughout the city. And to Bill's earlier point, missing middle is really great because a lot of people support it for a lot of different reasons. You can see a wide variety of organizations in Omaha that support missing middle, from environmental groups like the Sierra Club, Green Omaha Coalition, to architecture, real estate organizations, as well as just organizations really advocating for vibrant, diverse, and inclusive communities in Omaha. When we talk about missing middle, we're really referring to this type of housing in between single-family detached homes and mid to high-rise apartments. Bill will go over a whole lexicon of all of the different types of buildings that we're talking about, but it includes duplexes, townhouses, live-work buildings. And this is really missing in Omaha because of the zoning codes organization today. We have really these mid-rise, high-rise apartments on one side, and on the other have single-family detached houses, either in small lots or in large lots. And really what we're missing are these kind of in-between types of buildings that have a variety of different sizes, a variety of different price points, accessibility structures, which is really what we're advocating for, the inclusion of these in Omaha. I'm going to go over a few reasons why folks on our campaign and folks that we talk with in the community support missing middle. And one is that it creates walkable, pedestrian-friendly developments. So to Bill's point earlier, really what we've created in Omaha is neighborhoods that require cars in order to get to commercial sectors of the city. You can see this screenshot from 52nd and Center. If you want to get groceries, go to the pharmacy, that'll usually requires hopping in your car and driving to those places. And what we envision as a campaign is neighborhoods that you can live close to your essential services and don't necessarily require a car. You can see the streetscape below that has folks walking to their local cafe, to restaurants, being able to bike to where they want to go. And not only does this create really fun places to live, but it's also an important equity issue. Owning a car is extremely expensive for a lot of folks. It's a huge barrier to getting to places of work. So we really feel that creating missing middle can help kind of bridge that gap between allowing people to live closer to where they work and to essential services that they need to access on a regular basis. We also talk about appropriate density a lot. You might have heard some news stories, especially early in 2021. Omaha is really on this kind of tipping point of a housing crisis that a lot of cities and other parts of the US have been wrestling with for the larger part of a decade. In February of 2021, there were 3,000 real estate agents with less than 300 homes on the market. And this report from the Sherwood Foundation was also released, showing that 37% of East Omaha is housing cost burden, which means that folks are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And missing middle can really help with this because units are smaller in a lot of cases. You don't have to pick between a fancy apartment downtown or a large home with more square footage that's more expensive. There are more things and more options in between, but it also creates more units per building. This other report fact from the Sherwood Foundation shows that today there's a gap of about 80,000 units dedicated to affordable housing, and without any changes being made, that status quo will continue and will be about 104 units short by 2040. With more housing structures like the one in the background of this image, we can really increase that number of units that are accessible to lots of different types of folks in fewer structures than just single family detached. I mentioned that I'm really passionate about Missing Middle because of some of the environmental implications. Neighborhoods that include Missing Middle that have more folks living in a somewhat smaller amount of space allow for more walkable neighborhoods, less car dependent. You can see in this neighborhood on the right that you really require a car to get everywhere. A lot of folks look at this image on the right and see lots of greenery. It might seem awesome for the environment, but really this type of middle green space doesn't really allow for any biodiversity, for any large animals to thrive in these kind of set aside green spaces. What's much better for the environment in terms of land use is to have parks set aside in urban spaces, and then really preserve larger swaths of natural areas for animals, flora, fauna, all of that great stuff. You can also see when we're talking about land use, this is a great contrast that we have here. Both of these images are 640 acres. The one on the left, in that whole square, there's 761 homes, and then you can see the same number of homes, just smaller units that are detached, that don't have these big yards in this little square up here, 732 homes. Like I said, there are lots of other great ways that we can use land. We can set it aside for places for animals and plants to thrive, for people to be able to visit on the weekends and hike. But when we create spaces like the one on the left, it creates really car dependent locations that use much more resources, not just in terms of land, but also in terms of fossil fuels, electricity, natural gas, all of those things. Finally, wanted to highlight this great stat from the Heartland 2050 Vision Report. This was a report that Heartland 2050 released in 2014. And they completed a series of studies asking folks what housing type they feel like would work best for them in the city of Omaha. You could see at the time of the survey, almost 70% of homes were large lot single family houses. And they presented a number of different scenarios. I just pulled out scenario A and scenario D. Scenario A is what we're on track to achieve by 2050 if the status quo stays the same, if we keep building these large lot single family homes at the rate that we have been doing so today. You can see that these small lot single family homes almost entirely disappear and reduce the number of multifamily and townhome options in the city as well. Scenario D was the most popular with folks that Heartland 2050 worked with. And then when they also looked at how these housing types matched the income of residents, Scenario D is a much better fit. It's much more diverse. There are many more options for different types of folks in different industries making different amounts of money. So that's what the target was defined as in the 2050 report, to have significantly more small lot single family homes. This could also include things like converted duplexes, triplexes, a great increase in townhomes and more multifamily as well. And with that, I'll pass it back to Bill to talk a little bit about the lexicon of Missing Middle and go over some zoning code trends.
Before I start talking about this, I did realize once I stopped talking that I didn't really fully address Corey's comment a little bit earlier. And I just wanted to reinforce, I don't think I'm saying anything that everyone doesn't already know, but the FHA, the Federal Housing Association guarantee of loans, and the GI Bill really enabled a lot of people to build and own their first home, which set in motion a great deal of generational wealth that they could pass on to their kids. I think it's not a surprise to anyone that homeownership is kind of the gateway to wealth as you move forward into further generations. The FHA and the GI Bill were not the same for everyone, and I think we all know that too. There was a tremendous amount of racism involved. It was exceedingly easy for a white GI returning from the Korean War, for instance, to get a home loan, but almost impossible in many situations for someone who was African American. So the other thing that I find interesting about missing middle housing is the scale is small enough that it's a good jumping point for generational wealth. It allows everyone the opportunity to start into some kind of development. And I think this is probably something that is key to all of you as you're kind of entering your career. But I think this is the scale of these is small enough that it's much easier to jump in and begin development ownership when you're not looking at a 24-unit apartment complex. So with that said, I just want to talk about a couple of terms. Again, most of you may know this. I always like to think that I know as much as the presenter when I go home. So this is going to be one of those opportunities where you can say, well, I knew all that. But obviously duplexes. Duplexes are connected side by side, or top and bottom types of houses. We used to call these St. Louis duplexes that were stacked, and I don't know why that term, where that term came from. I think it was just a prevalent type of duplex that probably came from St. Louis, but these are connected units. They're a great fit for someone starting out. My uncle started this way. He bought a duplex, lived in half, and rented the other half out, and it started his process for getting into development for the rest of his life. Okay, Grace? The fourplex, obviously the same thing. It's just multiples. An early or a smaller type of what you'd think of as an apartment complex. There are a ton of these in town that are side by side. I know that the fourplex in the image is 2 up and 2 down. There's a lot of those, but there's a lot of them that are kind of side by side as well. You see a lot of those in old Midtown in the older parts of urban North Omaha. Go ahead. Townhomes, again, can be stacked or can be side by side. The side by side is much more common, almost like a traditional row house organization. A lot of times the townhouses traditionally were a live-work arrangement where there might have been a shop on the lower floor and then the residences above. This was really popular, great place to see this. I'm sure you're not as wonky about some of this stuff as I am, but if you're in Chicago, it maybe has the best mass collection of this type of housing. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Chicago burned down just as there was a tremendous flood of immigrants coming into the United States. They stopped in Chicago, set up a bakery on the lower floor with their residents above, or a little grocery store, or a small little bar. There's a really common type of housing at the turn of the last century into the first quarter beyond that. Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Bill, there's a question in there from Jerry about the building code. I know Derek's going to talk a little bit more about code later, so if we want to address it then, that's fine, but just want to make sure you saw that
Yeah, I
comment.
did see that. We will, yeah, let's get to that with Derek. I'm going to throw that into him. So then there's a whole selection of kind of middle-sized units. Sometimes they're arranged around a courtyard. There's a couple of examples from Dundee where there's multiple buildings that have multiple residences in each building, but they're arranged around a courtyard. They're really, really quaint and really nice. Beautiful settings. You would not, when you think of this lower left corner, I believe that's a 12-plex or a 16-plex. And when you think about 16 units on a site, you think about a typical big square apartment building. But this has great residential scale. It's only 2 stories high. It's great on the street. And again, this is another example of housing that was built right off of the streetcar stop in Dundee. And there are auto court arrangements where you drive in and have access to residences at the front door as well. But basically, this multiplex middle it encompasses a lot of different types of building types. Okay, sorry about that, Grace. I want to talk really quickly about the zoning code. And this is a very high elevation look, and this specifically about residential. You may not know all of this as well, but basically in Omaha we have an R1 through an R8 zoning classifications, and they go from single family to multifamily. Go ahead, next slide. What you see is kind of that recreation of that whole have and have nots again. The R1 through R3 are typically big houses on big-ish lots. And I'll go through that a little bit after this. The R7 and R8 are really large scale multi-residence apartment buildings. But if you're looking at developing missing middle, this R5 and R6 I think is the sweet spot. These zoning classifications start to enable multiple units to be placed on a single lot or connected. And I think this is probably, if you're looking at moving forward into development, those are your sweet spots. Okay, go ahead. So I'm going to go into each one real quickly, very, very high level overview. But R1, I mean, that's the castle. That's a big house, really big house on a really big lot. The lots have to be at least 20,000 square feet, which is just under half of an acre. They can't be any higher than 35 feet, so basically 3 stories, but spread out on large lots. The intent is for these to be very low density. R2 steps down a little bit. It's still single family on a relatively large lot. It's 10,000 square feet, which is just under a quarter of an acre. But again, low density, single family detached housing, a height of 35-foot maximum, which is roughly 3 stories, give or take. There is the ability to have single family attached here, but it requires a special use permit with a lot of hoops to jump through with the city. Okay. R3, we're starting to get into what a lot of people think of when they think of single family homes. This is still a pretty good sized lot. Relatively, they call it medium density, but it's not necessarily big houses that you see, but you see real big yards. Still a 35-foot maximum building height to keep those under 3 stories or 3 stories or below. And you can also do single family attached here as well with a special use permit. Go ahead. Now we're starting to get into what is really the workhorse, R4 and R5 for zoning in Omaha. 5,000 square foot is kind of the middle ground. It's the sweet spot for lots in Omaha. This is medium density. It's designed around single family residences on standard lots. It does allow townhouses and single family attached with a special use permit as well. Again, still that 35-foot maximum. So up until this point, everything's really geared towards single homes on single lots. You can, in some of these, do multiple units on a single lot, but it requires a special use permit. Okay. R5, this is where I said what the beginning of that sweet spot is. The size of the lot goes down. It's a 4,000 square foot lot minimum, but it's really intended to be an urban lot rather than a big suburban lot. This now, at the first time, does allow duplexes and single family attached and townhomes on the lot as part of the base zoning. It still stays within a 35-foot maximum building height, but this is where you start to see a fair amount of density being brought into housing. And also much more akin to what you see in the older lots and housing typologies that are historic in Omaha. Okay. R6, you start to get into, they call it low density multifamily. You still can do a single family residence on this, but you start to see this geared towards kind of a low scale multifamily. They're hopefully looking for density of about 20 dwelling units per acre here. Duplexes, single family attached, townhomes, and multifamily are all allowed in R6. Still a 35-foot maximum height though, so looking to keep the overall scale of the buildings at about 3 stories and below. Then R7 is where we start to really ramp up. One thing that might be a surprise to most people is the majority of Dundee was rezoned as R7 and R8, a good chunk of it. So you do still see a lot of single family detached homes, but there's nothing to say someone couldn't come in and buy up a bunch of lots and build a 5-story apartment building here. The R7 is medium density multifamily. You can still build a single family home here, but it's really geared toward multifamily, duplexes, attached residences like townhomes and multifamily. This gets the desired zoning ramps up to about 40 dwellings per acre, which is double of the R6. And you see that the height jumps up to about 75 feet, which is roughly, depending on your floor to floor, it's in between probably 5 or 6 stories. Go ahead. And then R8 is pretty much whatever you want to do. R8 is high density. It's really intended to be more of an urban zoning classification. Duplexes, single family attached townhomes, those are all allowed, but really R8 is really geared towards multi-story, high density housing. It's 150-foot maximum building height. In Omaha, anything over 75 feet is considered a high rise and requires a whole nother level of codes and fire protection. So this is not something that anybody gets to step into lightly. And it's really geared towards pretty much your downtown business core, or in some cases, there's some areas where you start to see this level of building, for instance, around Children's Hospital, where you see a building of this height in that along major corridors. Okay, I saw a question come up. Yeah, we're gonna let Derek deal with that too. Derek, you're gonna have to do all the hard stuff. So with that, I think we're gonna hand this over to Derek. And I told you all the things that you can do. And now Derek's gonna tell you why it's so hard and all the hoops that you have to jump through. And I actually asked Derek to kind of do a brief overview of the history of zoning, which as a wonky architect in Omaha, I found that really fascinating because I've always wondered and I've never really seen it. And he jumped in and kind of came up with some cool stuff. So, all right, you're on, Derek.
Thanks, Bill. You can go to the next slide. So this will just be a quick overview of Omaha's zoning history. So our first zoning ordinance in Omaha was approved by our city commission back in 1920. Next slide. And it's pretty interesting. So our second major update to our zoning ordinance was actually a few years later in 1924. But in that document, it talks about Omaha was the third city in the country behind New York and St. Louis to adopt a zoning ordinance. And then after that, there were thousands upon thousands of ordinances adopted by other communities. But most planners know that most of these communities, and even Omaha, are zoning is basically copy and paste. So there's a lineage you could see from community to community that have very similar regulations to regulate the built environment. But came across this document when I first started the city 15 years ago, and was surprised that Omaha was kind of on the leading edge of adopting a zoning ordinance. So next slide. And really, it was very simple, although the first iterations of our zoning ordinance were pretty simple. It's basically two different maps, a height and area district map and then a use district map. And there are very few uses. It was really boiled down to, even within the residence district A and B, it was single family, 2 family, and then multifamily, and multifamily was 3 and above. But it's really interesting to look at, and if any of you want to see these old maps, I have them. You can take a look at them. I kind of geek out on these too, but if you look at the height and area district map, it really follows those streetcar lines back in the day. And Bill's correct, the Dundee area, there's a big swath in there that was up to 60 feet in height that was allowed. And then subsequently, we have rezoned that area down over the years, but with some pockets of higher density. And then basically the image on the left kind of shows how the regulations are implemented with setbacks and height requirements and and it's a pretty interesting drawing. It's actually better diagrams than we have in our existing regulations. Next slide. And this is, I just noticed this when I was looking at my slide. So this, the third major update happened in 1945, where we went away from the two different maps to one map. So we started regulating uses and heights and areas within each district. So there was quite a few different districts that came into being in 1945. What was added in 1945 that we didn't have before was off-site parking regulations. So many parking spaces per unit, and then so many parking spaces per commercial square footage. So this is when we started regulating parking. Before then, we didn't regulate parking, which is kind of interesting. So if you see a lot of the areas east of 50th Street, east of 60th Street, a lot of the homes didn't have off-street parking. You parked on the street. That was normal. So this was our third iteration, major iteration. One thing I will say, from 1920 all the way through the existing zoning ordinance today, the city has made tweaks here and there. So we didn't go 40 years and do a major rewrite. It was minor changes, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. Next slide. So in 1956, we went from a strong mayor commission, or from a commission form of government to a strong mayor and council form of government. And that was the first year that my department was called a department. We were the black sheep that was moved from department to department before this. And so we became a real department in 1956, hired a planning director, and he was planning director for the next 20 or 30 years or so, and he's a professionally trained planner. And around this time, we made some more significant changes to the zoning ordinance. Next slide. So our current zoning code dates back to 1987. Took a lot of information from that 1945 code, but we did a major rewrite. One major thing that was added in 1987 was landscape requirements. Before then, we didn't have any requirements for trees, street trees, and other landscaping. And that was pretty controversial back then, that we would require landscaping. So the developers did not like that. However, I think that was a good thing to be added to the zoning regulations. Some of the other things since 1987, it's not like we didn't touch the regulations, but we've added quite a few things to make things easier. It's still not as easy as it should be, but we added urban design overlay to really get back to the way development occurred around our streetcar lines, where buildings were brought up to the street. We started requiring certain types of pedestrian ways and landscaping. Other things we've added too is to actually make missing middle easier through our planned unit redevelopment tool that was developed 5 or 6 years ago, which has been very popular, to allow the development that used to happen back in the early 1900s. However, that still requires approval process. That still requires planning commission or planning board approval and city council approval. And with that brings the whole NIMBY factor. I'm sure you're all aware of that. Every time I talk in one of these forums, I always talk about the NIMBY factor, where it's the not in my backyard, or I've got mine, forget yours. And you could say that a different way if you'd like. But basically, NIMBYs allow the neighborhoods to control a lot of the conversation through redevelopment, infill development, which some of it's good, some of it's not so great. But what I'm saying is our code allows some flexibility, allows missing middle housing, but it's not by right. So you can't just buy some property and start to develop missing middle housing, which is problematic. And the main things that with this 87 code, again, that has been changed over time, that really restricts the development of missing middle housing is the site development regulators. So in the R4 district, you have to have 5,000 square foot lot per dwelling unit. So if you have 2 dwelling units, you need a 10,000 square foot lot. So that really hampers multiple dwellings on one site. And then all the setbacks that are anywhere from 25 to 35 feet front yard setback, rear yard, side yard, all of those things together, including parking, really restricts infill development, and especially missing middle development. I'm not I don't work in permits and inspections, but I know for a fact, going back to the earlier question on building code, the building code can be onerous for missing middle, especially once you go from 2 units to 3 units. So three units and above, you have to get into the commercial code and away from residential code, which adds a lot of cost to every one of those projects. I'm not sure on the stack duplex. I'm sure there are issues with that. Again, I'm not work in the permits and inspections section division, but I know for a fact that those cause issues for these types of development. So both the zoning code that we have today and the building code, we definitely need to make some changes. Luckily, there's been a lot of conversation around affordable housing, around housing in general, that's taking place. So I'm happy to see that. So I think with some of those conversations will lead to action, because I'm hearing more council members talking about it. In the last election, there was quite a few people talking about it. So to boil it down, I think with our code today, just the site development regulators and the fact you have to go through approval process, that brings in the whole NIMBY factor, which really limits everything. Next slide. I have 2 more slides and we can get into questions, specific questions, but this is a really good way to look at things as far as zoning. I don't know how many of you know about form-based zoning versus traditional zoning. We have traditional zoning in Omaha, and we allow form-based code through approval process that was approved last year through our transit-oriented development. So on the traditional zoning, or what dorky planners like me it's called Euclidean zoning. Traditional zoning really focuses on use and operations, and not so much on form. On form-based codes or our TOD code that is available, it focuses on all 3 equally. And really what we're trying to get at, and what a lot of people are talking about locally and nationally, is looking at the form, regulating the form of the structure, and really which would allow more missing middle housing, and not so much in the operations and use. And more communities are going to this way of regulating, getting away from talking about density and units. Once you start talking about units, it becomes very unpopular in a lot of our neighborhoods, because the way the layperson looks at units, it's a bad thing. But as far as planners and everybody in this industry, density and more units is actually a positive thing. Next slide kind of gets to more of what we want to get to. I hope we can get to in the future, but basically trying to replicate what happened in history in the built environment, both in Omaha and other communities. Physical character, how the buildings relate to the street, bringing in vibrant businesses. I love traveling through East Omaha and seeing these commercial units embedded in neighborhoods. In West Omaha, that's not allowed. It's actually frowned upon, which is unfortunate, because I love our old neighborhoods with the commercial uses embedded in the community. And it really gets at accommodating and promoting pedestrians, transit, bicycles, not so much focusing on car-centric type of built environments, and arranging housing types and businesses, and really great public spaces. I think that's my last slide. But I think there's a lot of conversations happening to kind of finish up my part, but there's a lot of conversations happening today. And I think they're good conversations. We should have had them a long time ago, but luckily we're seeing a lot of infill development. We're talking about affordable housing. This will lead to action, I feel. And one thing that I'll plug, we're in the process of hiring a consultant to do an affordable housing action plan as required by the state. That'll occur next year. And these conversations are around zoning code that allows missing middle housing, building code that is more flexible, that allows more of the units that we need to see in Omaha will be discussed as well. And following that plan, there'll be an implementation plan to make some changes. I don't know what it looks like today, where will be the end of next year when that plan's adopted by council, but I have a lot of hope that we'll see a lot of changes. So with that, I'll stop talking and
I can help you field some questions, Derek. Yeah. I think Jerry had a couple of comments and questions specifically about that stack duplex. Jerry, do you want to unmute yourself and I don't know if you had questions or if these are just comments.
I guess, you know, I'm an advocate for affordable housing, and as someone who develops, I aspire to do affordable housing. And I think there's just things embedded in our codes that prevent us from achieving that aspiration. We just pulled 5 building permits from the city of Omaha for a stacked duplex. The International Residential Code, which I'm required to get my contractor license for, so I test on the International Residential Code, I test on the International Building Code. Omaha Code has a carve out, and in the case of a stacked duplex, you know, our city requires cast iron. That just
Well, I think you're,
it's not a code change. I knew it was in the code. But can you hear me?
yeah, you broke up a little bit there. We
Yes.
heard about the cast iron requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, one thing that
it's going to cost about $2,000.
Go ahead.
Just gonna say, Jerry, you're cutting out. I'm gonna let Bill talk now.
Yeah, one thing that as an architect we face all the time is that's less of a it's certainly not a planning issue, and it's really it really goes back to, we have an extremely strong plumbing union in town. I'm going to speak as an architect, and Derek, you feel free to disagree with me here, but the joke in architectural circles is the plumbing board is referred to as the plumbing employment organization. They have a lot of requirements in there that are not required in peer cities or cities of our size and building types. And really, I think that it's a hard argument to say it's something other than to make sure that union plumbers get to keep working on projects. It's really easy to do PVC, and really, I mean, heck, I can do PVC. I can't do cast iron. So what it does is it requires that a high level of plumber do it. It's not only expensive from a material standpoint, but it's expensive from a labor standpoint. You're exactly right. I have seen some movement in some of those areas, especially from a supply standpoint, and a little bit in waste. And I think that I'm guessing that in the next number of years, we're going to see that loosened up quite a bit.
Yeah, and to get back to what I was talking about next year, and with the Affordable Housing Action Plan, if we can list out all of these things, and I'm sure Jerry has a list. I've spoken to him about all the things that are barriers to produce great development, and if we can create a list and then quantify the cost and then demonstrate what the code is doing to new development and barriers to infill and redevelopment, coupled with the conversation around affordable housing, I think that would go a long way. I can't really speak to the union side of things. I've seen that on multiple trades and the authority they have. But if our council members and the general public keep pushing on this affordable housing issue that is only going to get worse in Omaha, I think we would see some relaxation. But so I think for me as a planner, going through some of Jerry's developments and understanding some of the issues, I think he would be a vital voice at the table to demonstrate the barriers that our building code places for new development and infill development. So I appreciate his input.
Yeah, and we appreciate that you are encouraging whatever entity is doing that housing study or the plan to engage with developers, especially developers from our program, as a way to kind of catalog that list. Satyam had a question.
Yeah, I guess this could be for both Will and Derek, but as a new developer, I've seen, I have a desire to build something in that missing middle, such as a duplex, most likely a side-by-side or a stack type of duplex. And I've been to some city planning meetings where it looks like the zoning, they're encouraging zoning changes from an R4 to R5. I'm looking at a couple sites right now for some duplexes, but the problem, like you mentioned, is that we're needing to purchase 2 lots to build 1 duplex. So even though the zoning has been upgraded to allow for, low density multifamily, having to purchase the 2 lots takes that advantage right back away, because now we have to, our lot size increases, and which increases our sales price and our rental prices. So whereas a 5,000 square foot lot, looking at some of the missing middle examples, they are able to fit duplexes, and they're kind of advocating that you can use the same 5,000 square foot lot that single family homes are being built on, and you can fit a duplex on there. It might not be the ones that we're seeing prop up now that require larger lots, but they can be done. So if we're, as somebody who hasn't developed but is looking to develop a duplex on and without having to take 2 lots, how would you recommend I negotiate that with the city, or kind of show that, there was one example Will had shown on one of the slides where the garages were kind of not attached to the structure, but they were pushed back and inside. So the lot didn't have to be as wide, proposing something like that. How would you recommend we try to negotiate with, that a duplex can be built on a smaller lot instead of needing 10,000 square feet?
Yeah, the best way to do that, and that's the tool I mentioned that we adopted 5-6 years ago, the planned unit redevelopment tool. I forget the number of those that that the council has approved over the years, but that tool is specifically was passed specifically to allow that type of development. So you have your building coverage can be greater and more units per square foot of lot. So, and unfortunately, what that PUR brings with it is you have to have plans and elevations, and you have to meet all the urban design requirements, which is, materials. That brings cost to or increases cost of the project, but that's the best tool. So anywhere in Omaha, you can get pretty much R5 zoning. That's really easy to do. So you're correct about that. You're also correct the fact that you need quite a bit of lot to build 2 units. So what I would recommend to you is just investigate and talk to one of our current planners about the PUR tool. We've worked through a lot of developments with that tool to bring those to fruition. Again, that brings city council approval, it brings the neighborhood to the table. But I would start with that PUR tool.
And that is, so if it doesn't currently have that PUR distinction, that's something we would request to the city to give this particular site a PUR distinction to allow for that. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's basically a negotiated approval that goes through planning board and city council. But there you have to do a lot of upfront work with site plans, elevations, and everything else. But that would be the best thing. And I could send you some the materials on that. We have our infill design guidelines that describe the type of development that we would like to see, that we would recommend for approval. I can also send you that part of the code too that talks about all the requirements and everything you need. But I think that's the easiest thing to do, although still difficult. It's the easiest thing to do in your situation.
Yeah, it's easy, but you have to be, unfortunately, you have to be prepared to, unless you can do all that yourself, you have to be prepared to invest time and energy to produce the documentation that's required just to submit an application. And then if it doesn't go through, you conceivably could have lost all that. So it's challenging. Absolutely.
And you can, we've talked about the pre-application meetings in the past. You can come to the table, have a sketch of what you'd like to do, get feedback from our department, Public Works, and then go invest in what I've said in these forums. Always invest in a good architect and a good engineer, because if you don't, you'll pay for it on the back end. So, but yeah, that's correct. You have to spend some money up front.
Thank you.
I put out a question in the chat. I don't want to put you on the spot, Derek, but
It's a great question.
Yeah, we've talked in this forum before about that TOD, the overlay, and is that the most likely mechanism by which we can push density in missing middle? Or since it's been 34 years since we've had a major code update, is that what we should be advocating for? So I want to hear from you, but I also want to give, I think, Grace a chance to chat a little bit about this missing middle campaign as a grassroots movement and what their advocacy strategy is. So,
Yeah, so it has been a long time. So that's too long for a major update. So one thing we haven't talked about this morning is our master plan. So everything that we do with the built environment, money that the city spends on streets and everything else has to conform with our master plan. So as far as the built environment, you have to comply with the master plan. Our master plan is actually 24 years old. So it's a little younger than our zoning code, but what really has to happen first is a master plan update, which we've been discussing for quite some time. So that needs to occur first to set that foundation, to set that policy. And then we would work into a complete overhaul of our zoning code, which then would support the policies that were adopted, that the community advocated for. And then this zoning code update would happen. And what I'd like to see is a more form-based code that would encourage the housing that we need and people that what people desire to. So before we get to a code update, we have to do a master plan update. So if you're talking to anyone that has anything to do with planning, just advocate for a master plan update.
Hey, Derek, can you talk a little bit about who has the ability to change zoning in the state?
Change zoning on a piece of property.
Not a piece of property, but a zoning change kind of in a global sense.
So as change our zoning code. So it's the mayor or council members can recommend the department update our zoning code. So, and that can also happen through advocacy as well. So Missing Middle Housing campaign could and has, I believe, go to our council members and the mayor and say, hey, it's time. So a major update that really has to come from our elected officials.
Yeah, that was a question that came up a lot that I kept hearing when I was on the transportation oriented development stakeholders group. Boy, that's a mouthful. But there was a lot of people attended those meetings saying, well, why don't you just change the zoning? And it's an easy thing to ask, but it really has to go through basically as a city council, or the state has the ability to, don't they, Derek?
Kind of. That's kind of what happened, why we're required to do this affordable housing action plan. It was a compromise. Senator Wayne and another senator in Lincoln, I forget his name, had a bill, LB 866, which they were going to force every community over a certain size to change their zoning code. A lot of communities didn't like that. They thought it was state overreach or government overreach, and so a lot of communities pushed back on that. So there was this compromise that was struck that requires communities to adopt this affordable housing action plan, which that action plan has to have components of how you will change land use policy and zoning to allow more development to occur in the development that we talked about this morning. So they kind of pushed it. Other states, California, Oregon, they've really pushed it. Basically, in the popular sense right now, in planning circles have pushed to ban single family zoning, not basically to allow missing middle anywhere in your community. That's, I think, where Senator Wayne was trying to go with his original bill, but got pushed back from that. But other states are doing it for sure. I think in California, all the communities have to allow more dwellings per single family lot than their existing zoning ordinance allows. So the state can do it as well. It's just a longer process and more political. And the last thing I'll say about that, when LB 866 came out last year for debate, it happened at the same time we were adopting going through our process of transit-oriented development. And we heard from a lot of neighbors that were very unhappy. They were very fearful of what that change would cause to their community. And I heard some really ugly things from neighbors. We had thousands of comments. I read every one. And there was talk about NIMBY, man. That was pretty ugly. So there's this whole balance, this dance between where we really need to go and what our community thinks we are going. So long-winded
No,
Yeah,
that's
sorry,
great.
Bill.
I want to give Grace a chance to chime in because I think, on this call and listening to this recording are maybe some advocates that can send happy comments to you next time, Derek, and can be supporters of change. So Grace, I'm going to call on you. And then we do have another question from Sonia after that.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, I think missing middle, the YIMBY definition got put in the chat, and we really consider ourselves the kind of premier advocacy group for the Yes in My Backyard movement going by missing middle. But we recently defined kind of our main goals as a campaign. One is to kind of serve as this educational outreach foundation. We have a group of folks who are really passionate about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and allowing those by right throughout Omaha in the zoning code. So we're in the process of talking with a lot of neighborhood associations and other community members about that. One of our other priorities is to allow and expand the TOD zoning on all current transit routes and in future transit corridors. That was a really great step that we saw in the past year, TOD being implemented on the Orbit line. And then finally, to Derek's point, our fourth one is advocating for an updating of the city's master plan. We understand that that's a really key process and probably the most efficient way to allow for lots of different types of housing. So I'll just put out some ways that you folks can support. Really simply, we post a lot on Facebook, so amplifying any of those messages really helps us out and get the word about the benefits of this type of housing. If you work for an organization or own an organization that wants to be a coalition member, we just add your logo to our website and reach out to you if we have a petition or something that we'd love for you to sign on in support of. And then we have volunteer opportunities as well. So if you're interested in helping us organize events, create content, be a presenter at neighborhood association meetings, there are lots of ways that you can get involved, and you can reach out to me directly or through our Missing Middle Omaha Gmail that I'll add. Did I miss anything, Bill, about kind of what we're working on and ways folks can support as a campaign?
No, I don't think so. I do want to just throw out one other thing that I think is kind of fascinating, and I'm not an expert on this, Derek, so if I don't have it right, you can publicly correct me. But I think there's a really interesting, I think the future of Omaha is in a bit of a quandary because we're running out of developable land, and we haven't run out of land, but we're running out of land. You don't think of it in terms of that because when you drive west, there's just still a bunch of grass. But as far as developable land, I think I heard somewhere, Derek, that the expectation is that somewhere in 2040 or somewhere around that range, all the major intersections will have been developed, left in the county because the city can't grow beyond the county. But there's a ton of potential in Midtown and in some of these really under densified parts of town, and it feeds right into missing middle housing. If you can take what's essentially a parking lot now or a house in the middle of a bunch of ground and turn it into 3 residences, it not only creates a more dense city, but from the city's perspective, it creates a tremendous amount of tax revenue. And I think that there's an economic incentive for the city to eventually really embrace this missing middle housing and at least go from low density to medium density in a lot of parts of town.
Yeah, I was gonna recommend that to your PowerPoint that I could send you my slides, but we have a whole slide deck that talks about how much land we have left in Omaha. And basically, and I joke that when I give presentations to groups that are not, in the know about development, they always ask me a question: when's Omaha going to grow to Lincoln? And I say, well, never, because we can't. So we can't grow out of the county boundaries. Plus, on the western side, we can only grow to the Elkhorn River. So we do only have 25 to 35 years of greenfield development. So, and we've quantified that based upon different densities. So we have to be smart on how that development happens. And we also need to start encouraging a lot more infill development. And there's a lot of our commercial corridors like Center Street, Maple, there's so much room available to redevelop. The problem is like, if you look at like 84th and Center, that's a huge redevelopment site in my mind. But what we had to go through to redevelop Crossroads, it was very painful process to make that happen. So the numbers just don't work out in redeveloping these commercial corridors today. But I think in the future, we're really going to have to figure that out. But there is huge opportunities, tremendous opportunities for infill development in Omaha that can drastically change the way we look today. So I could send you those slides, Bill, because I think that's a big point, is that we're going to run out of land soon.
Yeah.
For me being the long range planning manager, we're going to run out of land tomorrow. So
Everyone just has to remember that New York City, Long Island used to be farmland. So at some point it's going to densify.
yeah.
Sonia, did you still have a question?
It was answered, but I do have one more. So obviously we know middle housing is missing, and we're talking about a master plan that's 24 years old. What can we do to speed up the process? I mean, I know there's I know there's many things that are involved, Derek. By the way, hello. But it's good to see you as well. What can we do to try and speed things up? Because time is of the essence, time is money, and the longer we take, the more it's going to cost.
Yeah, I would just work with Missing Middle, because they've been a strong advocate supporting a master plan update. I know some of our elected officials understand this, but I would contact your council member and let them know that it's, given your industry, your what you do for a living, maybe not the main thing you do for a living today, but the main thing you do for a living tomorrow, that you have a vested interest in a plan that is up to date. Because one thing that I always talk about, there's a lot of things that are different from today that were in 1997. So yeah, a lot of things are different. Technology, climate change, there's so many things. One thing I will say about the master plan, so yeah, advocate with the council members and your peers. One thing I will say about an update, it's not a quick process. It's 2 years at a minimum. And there's a lot of public engagement because it's really the community's plan. It's not my plan. So a lot of community engagement has to occur. And we have to have a lot of conversations and a lot of hard conversations about things we haven't talked about as a community, just about FHA and redlining. Those conversations need to take place. So simple answer is communicate with your council member.
Yeah, I think that group advocacy would be right on the money. Sonia, I know you sent that message to me, but amplifying our voices, showing up at city council when someone's advocating for a dense project, kind of counterbalancing that NIMBY voice with the YIMBY voice, I think is kind of at the heart of what Missing Middle campaign is about. So yeah, are there any other questions? We have a request to share email. Is it okay if I send out your email addresses to everybody on the call, Bill and Grace and Derek?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we'll get a copy of the presentation that we can send out to folks too.
Sure thing.
Okay. Any other questions before we shut it down and give you some time back in your day? We have some kudos in the chat. Outstanding presentation. Thank you all for your time today and your expertise. Hopefully we can drum up some more advocates for you in this charge to increase missing middle housing in Omaha. I will send out this presentation and the link to the recording and the slides and the contact information tonight in a wrap-up email. If you have a chance to click on the link for the survey, that's how we continue to present information like this. If you could fill out that survey and let us know what you thought of the session, that would be a big help. Thank you all. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Derek. Like I said, Derek, next time you get a free t-shirt for sure. Have a good one, everybody. It's great
Thanks,
to
everyone.
see you. Have a good day.